All right. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to silence us for just a little bit, and then I will let you unsilence yourselves at the time. Okay, and now we are ready. Now we're ready to go. Okay. All right. When we left off at Mount Sinai. Moses standing on the top, the Jewish people assembled around the base of the mountain, God revealing his will to the people in 10 declarations, 10 principles, 10 organizing ideas that encompass all of the other commandments in the Torah. I told you that the 10 commandments are not all of the commandments, but they are the 10 general categories into which all 613 commandments of the Torah can be organized. Following our discussion last trimester, we come now to look at those laws. The next 3 chapters of the book of Exodus, chapters 21, 22, and 23, are loaded with laws. There are 100 verses in those 3 chapters, and I could spend weeks and weeks on 3 or 4 or 5 verses. There is no way I'm going to take you through the laws. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to just take you through one particular subject tonight. If you find it fascinating, and I think you will, and you want to sign up for a different kind of an experience, to go through all the commandments and their meanings, that could take a couple of years itself. That's a really detailed study. It is not like our study up until now. Up until now, we have been talking about narratives. We're talking about stories, events, and the history of the Jewish people. The laws are a whole different section of the Torah. They're actually the essence of the Torah, but to understand it, you have to study deeply, and it will take a lot of time. Rather than covering 100 verses tonight, which is impossible, I'm going to cover 11. I'm going to take the first subject, only one subject tonight, but I will show you, I hope, how brilliant the Torah is in understanding the nature of humanity and prescribing a code of conduct for human beings, that you will walk away from this session and you'll say, wow, I never understood it could be that deep. I'd love to go through all the other 89 passages, 89 verses, and see what's happening in other places. We won't do that, but that's how I'm going to handle it. All right. So let us begin with the following. The 10 commandments, those are the general principles. Now we are going to start by looking at what the specific laws are that are contained in these next 3 chapters. And when you go through these 3 chapters, these 100 verses, you will discover something very interesting. You deal with criminal law, you deal with civil law, you deal with ritual law, you deal with commandments that have to do with the relationship of man and his fellow man, ethical laws, you deal with laws that have to do with man and God, theological laws, and you have all these laws grouped together in the same text. Now, this makes the Torah very different than a law book. If I wanted to look up law, if I was a student of law, there are different kinds of law books. If I was interested in civil law, I would have one set of law books. If I was interested in criminal law, I would have to turn to a different set of books. I would have to follow in a different set of volumes, because criminal law is a separate branch of law than what we would call torts, or criminal law is different than capital law, and it has different sources. If I wanted to study religious law, theological law, that would be another entire section, all right? But the Torah does not distinguish between criminal and civil and religious, because God, who is the God of everything, is the lawgiver for all areas. So you're going to discover, if you have looked at these next couple of chapters, you're going to discover that you'll go from one kind of law to another with no seeming relation. You'll be dealing with a case of civil law, and suddenly the next example will be criminal law. And then you'll go to religious law, and it seems to be no pattern. Don't look at this as a law book. It's not a law text. What these are concrete examples that give us important principles. So I decided that we would start with just the very first laws that come right after the 10 Commandments. After the 10 Commandments have been given in chapter 20 and we finish, the next section goes right into the laws and it deals with the laws of slavery. Okay, slavery. Okay. Now, I think that some of you have already asked the question before, Rabbi, the Torah recognizes the dignity of human beings. The Torah teaches us in Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, that all men are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Therefore, if all men are in God's image, how can the Torah speak about servitude or slavery? The Torah should just prohibit slavery. It should say something like, all men are created in God's image. No man should be a slave to any other man. Therefore, no man should own or control or exercise the authority of a lord over another man. We have studied the story of Pharaoh in Egypt. We have told the story how Pharaoh, a human being, was not right in enslaving other human beings, the Hebrews. You might think that as a result of the experience of the Hebrew tribes, as a result of their servitude in Egypt, God would say, just as you have known what it is like to be a servant, a slave, you are not allowed to own any slaves. You might have assumed that the natural result of the stories in Egypt is God forbidding us to have slaves whatsoever, a categorical imperative, a categorical law forbidding slavery. The Torah does not do that. The Torah instead regulates the way in which we are to treat these individuals called an eved. We're going to have to look at that term. So my first question to you is this. Why didn't the Torah, before we take a look at these laws, why didn't the Torah just come out and say, human beings are all children of God. It is not right for any human being to enslave or to oppress any other human being. And therefore, given both the general laws of human dignity and the laws that the Hebrews have learned from their experience in Egypt, why didn't God just say, we are therefore eliminating all slavery? The Jewish people will not practice the servitude of one group of people to another. Does anybody want to suggest a reason why the Torah did not just categorically abolish slavery? And if you do, just raise your hand and I'll call upon you and you could suggest your answer. Okay, go ahead, Jerry.
Could it have been the accompaniment of the vast mixed company that left Egypt along with the Israelites?
There was a mixed multitude that left Egypt. Most of them were Hebrews, but there were other people as well. But since God was giving legislation to this new group that he had formed in the desert, he could have easily said, you are all going to follow this same law, whether you are Hebrews, whether you are part of other peoples that join the Hebrews, this is going to be your law. Just because, Jerry, there was a mixed multitude does not mean that God couldn't have said, slavery is wrong, not just for Jews, but slavery is wrong for everyone. Therefore, I command you, you are not to own slaves. So, but God doesn't do that, okay? Why doesn't God do that? Mark, was that Mark Goodman? Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think it has to do with acceptance. That if the Israelites are to accept God's law, then it cannot run counter to the worldwide practice, which is human beings own, in some cases, other humans, in other cases, the labor of other humans.
Mark has pointed out a very important truth that I want us all to understand. Today, from today's perspective, we say God just should have eliminated slavery in general. We all know today that slavery, especially a certain kind of slavery, is immoral. But what Mark is saying is when you give law to people, you have to take notice, you have to pay attention to where the level of society is at that time. Although to us, 3,200 years later, the idea of abolishing slavery makes perfect sense. What Mark is saying is it would not have made sense for God to have imposed a new law, especially given the fact that slaves were a universal in world society. It would have made no sense for God to say to the Hebrews, you alone are not to have other slaves. Though you live in societies where slavery and servitude are common, you are going to follow a new rule. It is possible that the people would not have accepted that. It was just too outside the mainstream. It was bringing them too far ahead, too fast. They had to deal with the people as they were. Anybody else want to?
Lori's hand is.
Lori, go ahead.
I had two things. First of all, are we not reading Jonathan Sacks anymore?
We are reading Jonathan Sacks. As a matter of fact, hopefully you got the syllabus and we had a Jonathan Sacks article for tonight.
Oh, oops. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Second thing is, I think it goes along with what Mark said, that if some people or people in general still did not have their faith in God, if they didn't believe or trust him, then why would they choose to follow what he said?
All right.
Is that did he say that? Is it the same thing he said?
Well, they would follow him because he had demonstrated his power to them and he had revealed himself. But they wouldn't have understood, Lori, his rules. For example, let me give you an example. Today, if I tell you that marriage is not necessarily between a man and a woman, and that we have other categories of marriages involving LGBTQ and others, if I had said that 2,000 years ago, no one would have understood what I was talking about, right? Marriage was an institution that involved men and women, not that there weren't other proclivities then too, but when you spoke about marriage, you were speaking about the relationship between a man and a woman. To take our sensitivities from the 21st century and to try and to say then that any kind of relationship between two consenting adults is legit, it wouldn't have made any sense to them. The problem is that you have to deal with the people in the societies in which they live. Their societies were very different than our contemporary world. And therefore, in a world in which slavery was not only existent, but was prolific, everybody had slaves. Everybody took slaves for a variety of reasons. To have outlawed slavery would have not been to ensure the law was followed. It probably would have ensured that the law was broken, that people couldn't have abided by that kind of a stringent prohibition, okay? So I think that's what Mark is saying. He is saying, given the time and given this nature of the societies and the level of civilization of people at that time, they would never have accepted it, okay? In those days, a lot of things happened. If you killed someone in my family, the prevailing custom was that someone from my family would take revenge on your family. Courts of law weren't well established. So you were dealing with a society where if someone's family member was killed, the Goel Hadam, the blood avenger, would go out and take the life of the person who killed that. It's a different kind of a world. So you have to slowly bring people along to those higher levels of law. Anybody else? Okay, go ahead, Hal.
Just unmute. Also, one other factor in those days was the fact that for people who owed money, had debts, could not pay, committed minor offenses as opposed to capital offenses, being an indentured slave for a certain amount of time would pay off a debt to society, to monetary debt, or a criminal or civil debt.
What Hal is saying is the other half of the story. Before we can talk about the term Eved Ivri, a Hebrew Eved, we have to define what we mean. Okay, so let's do a little definition here. The word Eved can mean one of the following. It can mean slave. The Hebrews in Egypt were referred to Avadim. They were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, all right? The Jewish people are referred to as Avdei Hashem, servants of the Lord, the exact same word. If you want, they were slaves of the Lord. Slaves and servants, very different meanings, right? But the word avadim means the same thing. Avadim can mean a servant. Avadim can mean a slave. Avadim can mean, as Hal just spoke of it, an indentured worker. We'll talk about that, okay? What is an Eved? And in order to understand what an eved is, let me ask you a question, another question. How did people acquire slaves in ancient times? How could you become a slave in ancient times? What were the ways in which, if you were growing up in a certain place at a certain time, how might you suddenly find yourself to become a slave? What were the ways in which slaves were made? Anybody want to tell me that? How did you become a slave? Go ahead, Mark.
Primarily two ways. One was to be a war captive, and the other was to be a debtor.
Okay, let's deal with the first way. The ways in which many people became slaves is their countries were conquered, okay? And when you conquered a foreign people, what did you do with them? You destroyed their institutions, you broke their army, and then you took their people, men, women, children, and you turned them into slaves, right? So whether it was through a war, or even if it was not even a war, a conquest, my tribe decides to acquire the territory of your tribe. And we conquer your territory and we take your possessions and we take your people and we make them slaves, all right? So through conquest or through war, you can make a person a slave. And that is, by the way, oftentimes the way slavery occurred. Usually slaves were the citizens of a foreign land, a foreign country, a foreign area who were conquered by another people, and these people were taken to be slaves by the conquering army, okay? How else might you become a war? I'm gonna, Mark, avoid the question about debt for a moment. Besides conquest or war, how else might you become a slave? Go ahead, Elise. Elise, just unmute yourself. There you go. There you go.
Okay. Weren't there families that had their daughters become slaves into richer families in the hopes that they might marry the sons?
Okay. By the way, it still happens today. You're in the East, you have 20 children, you're starving, you can't live, okay? Not only can't you feed all your children, but you can't even feed yourself. So what do? And by the way, this is still practiced today, I'm ashamed to say. You sell off the excess kids as slaves and you use the money to feed the rest of the family, all right? It's an economic condition. I have too many people. I can't take care of my kids. I can't provide for them. Life is hard. Therefore, I'm going to sell them to people who have money, and they're going to acquire them as slaves. And that's how I'm going to continue to live. And unfortunately, some of my children are going to have to go into slavery. Okay, so very good. Okay, how else might you acquire slaves? These are all, and by the way, some of these ways still exist today. Still exist today. How else do you acquire slaves? Go ahead, Jay.
Often in the Muslim nations, they sell people into slavery. It might be similar to what you said, but for economic reasons, things like that.
Right. It's good business, Jay. It's good business practice. Forget about conquering self. There are people who deal in slaves, sex slaves, other kinds of slaves. Why? Because it's economically very good. If you have a commodity that other people want to buy, and you can trade that commodity and become wealthy in the process, there are a lot of people who would do it not for war, they would do it for economic motives, okay? You all know something probably about the triangle of trade between England and the colonies and Africa. And you know that as part of that triangle of trade, they traded in slaves. Slaves were needed in certain parts of the world to perform certain functions. So you took slaves in one area, you brought them to another area, and you sold them. It was economically feasible to become a slave because you could derive profit from slavery. Very good. Is there anybody else? I mean, we're seeing here there are a lot of ways of becoming a slave. Okay. Yes, go ahead, Marlene.
If you became an orphan, I would think you
Or-
might become a slave because
No one to take care of?
there's no one to take care of you.
Yeah. Now, remember, in those days, they didn't have orphanages, okay? They didn't have an orphanage. So let's say your parents died. Let's say they died in a battle, or let's say they died in general. There was no orphanage to take you in and teach you and feed you and rear you until you were an adult and then let you go. Oftentimes, children whose parents died, who became vulnerable, became slaves. That was the only way they could live, whether they themselves allowed themselves to be enslaved or other people trafficked in them because they were vulnerable. They had no one to protect them. All right. And finally, there's one other answer. Someone just doesn't like you. You know, I don't like you. Your existence offends me, and I'm going to make your life as miserable as I can by taking you and making your life tough. Okay. I'm going to sell you to this thing where you're going to break bricks every day of your life. Some people were made slaves because of punishment, okay? If you did something illegal, criminal, even if you were a citizen of the country in which you lived, if you did something criminal, you could pay for it by becoming a slave. I'm going to say something that's going to be interesting. The Eved Ivri, the Hebrew servant or slave or whatever you want to call him, could not become a slave in any of the ways we have just mentioned, okay? You could never become a Hebrew slave in any of the ways I just mentioned. Jews did not conquer people, did not enslave them, did not turn them into chattel, especially chattel. Unlike other countries in the world, like the Romans, where slaves had no rights, where they were talking animals or useful tools, that the master could do whatever he wanted to them and destroy them because they were, after all, his property and they had no rights. In Hebrew society, that was impossible because of two things. Number one, because all human beings were created in the image of God. And number two, because of the fact that the Hebrews who had experienced slavery and the brutality of slavery were not about to duplicate it themselves. So all of the ways we have just mentioned for becoming a slave, a Hebrew can never become a slave in any of those ways, okay? So now you're going to say to me, okay, Rabbi, then how does one become a Hebrew slave? And by the way, let me mention Hebrew slave. It means a slave who is a Hebrew or a Jew who is owned by another Jew, or not owned. I will talk about owned is a wrong term, okay? A Jew who controls a servant or whatever, an Eved, who is a master to a servant, never owns him in the physical sense. He does not own him. He has no right to do anything with him. He cannot, if he injures him or harms him, he can be held liable for it. The kind of slavery that you are thinking of in the South, where a slave master can do whatever he wants to his property. He can kill them. He can use them as sport. He can torture them. He can do whatever he wants because they have no rights. That is not what we mean by an Eved Ivri. That doesn't exist, okay? Doesn't exist. We are going to speak about what the laws are. The first 11 verses in this chapter deal with an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew servant. Whether you call it servant, whether you call it slave, however you term it, Eved. Eved is the term we use, and Ivri refers to a Hebrew slave. A Hebrew is a slave. I'm going to make two statements. A Hebrew slave never loses his status as a human being, and a Hebrew slave never loses his status as a Jew, okay? If you become an Eved Ivri, you remain a human being with all the rights pertaining thereto. And if you are Jewish and you become an Eved Ivri, your obligations as a Jew in many areas still remain, and the obligations of your master to treat you in a certain way follow from the fact that you are both a human being and you are a fellow Hebrew, okay? So now let's get into the question. Go ahead, Erwin, I'm sorry.
So if the Torah presented laws that had to be they had to be written in such a way as to be acceptable to the people of one period.
Correct.
Does that mean that the people of this period have the right to reinterpret the laws and apply them differently with different meanings?
It means the following, Erwin, that even in this period, you can choose not to have a Hebrew servant. By the way, the law doesn't say you have to have Hebrew servants. This law says if a Jew becomes the master to an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew servant, these are the laws he must follow, but it doesn't compel you or when to have one. As a matter of fact, you're going to see that today it's not necessary anymore because we have a different kind of society. So I would tell you this: the reasons that justify the existence of servitude in the time of the Bible don't apply in many modern democratic countries today. I'm going to show you that to be the case. And therefore, no, you don't have to, these laws would not be applicable today. How does one become a Hebrew servant? Let me give you an example. I would like to tell you that in society, everything is fair and equal and everybody prospers. You just be a good person and you work hard and you get what everybody else gets. In a communist society, that might be the case, but that's not the case. I'm going to read you something. In any society, it is inevitable that certain individuals will fare better than others. Some will become wealthy, while others will be poor. Some will enjoy financial blessing, while others suffer financial distress. Does anybody want to dispute that that's still applicable today? Okay, we know that's to be the case. Even though all human beings are created in God's image, even though all human beings share as human beings certain inalienable rights, we know that life is not fair. And we know that in life, some people will enjoy good fortune and some people will not enjoy good fortune. Guess what? This was true in biblical times as well, okay? People fell on hard times. I'm going to describe a situation to you. Two families, they both own land. But one family has a series of reverses. In his area of land, maybe the land has not been productive. Maybe in his region where he lives, the rain has not fallen. Maybe because of debts he has accrued in other areas, he is short of money. He's forced to sell property, okay? It sometimes happens that, everybody was still okay? It sometimes happens that people who suffer financial loss find themselves in a position where they can no longer support themselves anymore, okay? Okay. Let's say you lose the ability to support yourself or your family. You no longer can support yourself. You can't feed your family. What are you going to do? What are you going to do if economic situations are such that you have completely used up your resources? You have nothing to sustain you or support you anymore. Who are you going to turn to? Don't turn to Social Security. Social Security doesn't exist in biblical times. There is no Social Security. Don't turn to the safety net. There is no social safety net. Let's say you suffer terrible reverses and suddenly you find yourself helplessly poor to the point that you are starving. Okay. You can hope for charity. You can hope that people will provide you with charity. But apart from charity, what else are you going to do? Lori, go ahead.
Well, the logical thing is you turn to your friends and family to see if they can help you.
Okay.
And I don't know whether there wasn't any other outside resources. So if
Right.
you, just
Okay.
turn to people that you know who you can either live with or borrow from or.
And that's still the way, Lori, that it is today. It's that way with refugees as well. When you suffer from a calamity and suddenly your life is turned upside down, whether it has to do with food or housing or relocation or whatever, your first hope is to turn to people that you know to help you. But sometimes you don't know anyone who can help you, or sometimes the calamity is so great, the damage, the financial consequences are so severe that lots of people are in the same boat you are. And then you may have to turn, Lori, to outside people, and you're dependent upon the kindness of strangers. And in Jewish society, there were laws, we remember them, about charity, about giving charity, that's part of Jewish law. We're not going to discuss that, but that was built into the Jewish system. But let's say for one reason or another, all that charity doesn't help. What can you do? Erwin, go ahead.
I would take a job with whatever conditions are in place at the time.
All right. But the job market then was more limited than it is today. Most of the jobs, Erwin, in biblical times were agricultural jobs.
Yeah, well, that would be it. And you know, if what it takes is for me to commit myself for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you know, to
Very
support
good.
my family, that's what I would have to do.
Okay. Erwin needs money. He cannot support himself and he has a wife and children. He says, I have no income. What am I going to do? Erwin sells his labor to someone else in return for the ability to sustain himself. Now, if Erwin does that and receives a salary, we refer to Erwin as a hired laborer, correct? So Erwin would first say, look, I can work, I have an ability, I can't support myself anymore, but I can sell my services to someone else. And in return for hiring me, this person will take care of me and perhaps even pay me a wage that will support my family as well. I will become a hired laborer. Now, a wage laborer gets wages. There's a difference between a wage laborer and what is called an indentured servant. Would someone like to explain what is an indentured servant? What is the difference between a manual laborer, a person who works for wages, and an indentured servant? Someone want to tell me the difference between them? Go. Okay, Laura, you got your hand up again. Go ahead.
An indentured servant works for someone for a certain period of time, at which when that time is over, they have their freedom. But what I was also going to add is what a lot of people do today is they become entrepreneurs. They have a skill, or they design a product, or they find something that people want or need, and then they make a business out of that. But I don't know, like, if that was really a thing in biblical times, but
It was not. We live in a much more diversified economy, Lori. We live in a society where one can make one's living in a variety of ways. Unfortunately, in biblical times, when manual labor was really the one thing that people had to offer, becoming an entrepreneur in biblical times, opening up a 7-Eleven in Jerusalem didn't do it. Okay, there were no 7-Elevens in Jerusalem. All right. Entrepreneurial background came about later on with a different kind of economic society. So what you are right, what you did was you became an indentured servant. Indentured servitude refers to a contract between two individuals in which one person works for another, oftentimes not for money, but is repaid by being taken care of during the term of the contract, okay? So Erwin cannot afford to support himself or his family. He comes to me and says, Rabbi, could you help my family and I? Could you take us in? And I will agree to work with you for X amount of time. And in return, during this period of time, you will take care of myself. And if he has to bring his family into, and you will take care of my wife and my children. And in return for my labor, you will provide for me. And then at the end of that period, you will give me something that I can restart my life again. Okay, that would be an indentured servant. Some of you know that when you came to America from the old country, because passage to America was very expensive, the way you got there was you sold your services. You became an indentured servant. Someone bought your contract here, and they sold you, or they didn't sell you. They sold your services to someone else, and in return for this indenture, an indenture is just a contract, you had to agree to work for a certain amount of years. Let me say that a Hebrew servant, if I had to come up with the closest parallel, he is equivalent to an indentured servant. He's like a paid employee, except instead of being paid in salary, he is paid in terms of being taken care of. The other difference between a salaried employee and an indentured servant is time. Usually a salaried employee, a hired workman, works day by day or job by job, or for a small period of time. It is very unusual for a hired laborer to be engaged for years at a time. An indentured servant is different. An indentured servant works for a period of time as opposed to a longer period of time. Debbie, did you have your hand raised? Oh,
I have no idea what just
hold
happened.
on. Okay. Okay, there we go.
I don't-
Debbie, did you have your hand raised? No, okay. Did anybody want to make a comment at this point? Okay. All right, so now comes the next part. Okay. One way you could become an indentured servant was you became so poor that you had to sell your services to another person who became to you an adon. An adon, just like Eved is a hard term, servant, indentured servant. Adon means master, but it means a person who takes advantage of your service. In every relationship between a master and a servant, the master has the right to the servant's actions, his energies, his whatever, and in return, the master has certain obligations to the servant, okay? The purpose of the Torah is to stipulate what those obligations are from master to servant. Okay. If you acquire a Hebrew servant, how must you treat him, recognizing he is both a human being and a servant? And what are your obligations to him and what is his obligations to you? Okay. Now, there's a second way in which a person can become an indentured servant. Who wants to be a crook? Who wants to be a bad guy? Anybody want to be the bad guy in my example? Nobody? All right. Gary is my bad guy. Gary's fallen on hard times and he doesn't want to sell his services to me. Gary likes being his own man and whatnot. So he's going to earn money the old-fashioned way. He's going to steal it. He's going to go out and he's going to commit some illegal crimes. He may steal your property. He may burgle your house. Whatever it is, he's going to get money surreptitiously. Well, poor Gary is not very good at his enterprise and he gets caught. And he gets caught and he may have caused damage to his victim, whoever he stole from, whoever's property he damaged. And now the court says to Gary, all right, we caught you. You owe your victim a certain amount of money. And Gary says, tough luck, I haven't got any money. That's why I became a thief in the first place. I had no income. You want to get money out of me? Try squeeze a stone, get blood out of a stone. Court says, all right, you have no money, but you have incurred an obligation. You may have hurt someone. You may have damaged them. It's not just theft. You may have injured them. You may be liable to someone and you may be required to compensate that person for the injuries or the harm you have caused. Therefore, we're going to sell you, Gary, as an indentured servant, and the money that we get for your sale is going to go to pay off your victim, okay? Because there was no civil society. In those days, if I injured someone, no society was coming. You couldn't go to the state. If you damaged someone, especially through criminal activity, you were liable to pay. And if you had no money and you couldn't pay, the court would sell your services, would turn you into a Hebrew servant, and they would sell you to a third party. And the money that the third party paid for your services, Gary, you would have to turn over to the person that you harmed as an indemnity, okay? So these were the two ways. I'm going to repeat them again. The two ways in which a person can become a Hebrew servant is either one, he can sell himself as an escape from extreme poverty, or two, he may be a criminal who is sold by the court to raise funds to pay his victims. Okay, that's the way you become a Hebrew servant, okay? Not through war, not through conquest, not through dealing in human flesh. The ways a Hebrew servant becomes a Hebrew servant is through need. Either he sells himself into a situation of indenture, of servitude, or the court sells him into that situation because he must pay off a legal debt. Everybody good so far? Now we're going to go take a look at the text. Now I'm going to share the text with you. We're going to look at 11 chapters, all right? Let's see here. Share screen, got it. Okay.
Where is it?
Hold on, everybody, just a second. We are looking for it. Okay. apparently our last outage eliminated it. So we're going to read from the text. I'm not going to pull it up.
I can get it if you want.
Not if we have to go off.
Okay.
No, I don't want to do that. Okay, I will read to you.
It won't take long.
Huh?
It won't take long.
No, I don't want to go off and go back on again. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. I normally would not read to you. My wife has told me I'm not supposed to do that. We would read the screen together. But unfortunately, we can't because the screen doesn't exist. So if you have a book, turn to Exodus chapter 21, verse 1. And I will read to you, or we will read together, and then we will talk. Okay, Exodus chapter 21. Okay, no, don't bother. Okay. These are the ordinances that you shall place before them, all right? We are going to deal with the subject of a Hebrew Eved. If you buy a Jewish bondsman, he shall work for you for 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go free for no charge. Stop right there. All right, we know what the term of service is. When you sell a bondsman as an indentured servant, the period of time, the maximum period of time, can work for you 6 years. You have to let him go in the 7th year. Why? Why 7? Okay. What this telling us is you can't buy a person forever. You're not allowed to own a person. All you can do is have a right to his services, and even that you can only do for 6 years. Why the limit of 6 years? Somebody? Okay. Why 6? Why not 4? Why not? Why didn't? Go ahead, Joseph. Yeah.
A proxy for in Genesis, 6 days to create the earth, and the 7th day you.
Very good. There's something significant about the number 7. God works for 6 days, and on the 7th day, it is a day of release. It is a day of rest. You may know that there's a law that says 6 years you are allowed to plant and harvest and care for your property, your crops. Excuse me. But in the 7th year, called the sabbatical year, what are you supposed to do? Let the land lie fallow. Anything that grows of itself belongs to whoever wants it. The 7th year, the land is released. It is same was true with a servant. A servant may work for you for 6 years, but that's all. The 7th year, he goes free. Okay, you are not allowed to own a person forever, a Hebrew servant. You cannot own him. You cannot possess him. The most you have the right to do is utilize his services for 6 years. So when he is sold, when the person sells himself or the court sells him, he is only sold for a period of 6 years. In the 7th year, he goes out free. Number 1, okay? So there's a limitation, okay? If he shall arrive by himself, he shall leave by himself. If he is a husband of a woman, his wife shall leave with him. Okay, let's take this example. Erwin has sold himself to be my servant, okay? Erwin isn't married, so he comes in alone. He works for me for 6 years. And in the 7th year, he's fulfilled his contract, he goes out. But let's say Erwin has a wife and children. And he says, listen, if I work for you for 6 years, you're going to take care of me, but my wife and my kids are going to starve. What's going to happen with them? There's no social service agencies. They don't get food stamps. They don't get any kind of help. I will give you my services, but I need you to take care of my wife and my children as well. Now, that's a little bit more expensive, right? The master now has an obligation. Well, Erwin, I want you, but I don't want your wife or your kids. Do I have to take in the wife and the kids? If the wife and the kids are going to be in a position where they're going to starve to death, then I, the owner, have to bring in Erwin and his wife and his kids. Now, I am entitled to the useful services, the fruits of the labor of the wife and the children. I can use the children, say, to gather crops if they're older children. If the wife can spin or do certain things, I'm entitled to her labor. But if he comes in with his wife and his children, even though he's the one who wants to sign up for servitude, I got to provide for his wife and children too. This is already harder for me, right? Now I got to take in Erwin and his kids. Now, it is true that it was an agrarian society, so it was probably a little easier. And the kids those days didn't go to expensive prep schools, so I didn't have to send Irwin's kids to an expensive prep school. You know, they grew up on the farm, and if I could feed Irwin, I could feed his kids and his wife too. But in return for taking Irwin and his wife and his children in, I'm entitled to their useful help in whatever way they can help me. But when Irwin has served his 6 years, I not only have to release him, I release the whole family. You all go. You all go. Go ahead, Neil.
First, I got to be smarter than the mouse. Hey, is this considered one of the 613 commandments?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So being ultra orthodox, how do you keep this one in today's world?
Okay, that's a good question, and I will, if you remind me, Neil, I'll circle around to it back later on.
Okay.
Today, probably you wouldn't need to worry about it because with social agencies and whatnot and with government, see, today government provides services that in biblical times governments to societies didn't provide. We're used to a whole series, Neil, of safety nets and protections that guarantee that if people don't get charity from churches or private organizations, government will take care of them. There was no government to take care of them then. So I could tell you that nowadays, when there are other social agencies that do this, maybe some of these laws don't have to be employed. But the idea is that Hebrew society still has this idea of obligation for those who are in need. A big part of Jewish law is we must look after those who cannot care for themselves and the ones that they love. We have a mutual obligation. Go ahead, Neil, go ahead.
Does it exist in the ultra-Orthodox communities?
Yes.
As of today, it does.
Yes, it does. I'll explain to you a little
Okay.
later. Okay, all right. So here we have it. I take in a man. He works for me for 6 years. If he came in by himself, at the end of 6 years, he either had no wife or she went back to live with the mother and she didn't need to be taken care of. She can do whatever she wants. The children, if they can be taken care of. But if they come in with Irwin, I have to release them together with Irwin. Now look at the next part of this. If he shall arrive by himself, he shall leave by himself. If he is the husband of a woman, his wife shall leave with him. If his master will give him a woman, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out by himself. All right, now, okay. What are we talking about here? Okay. Here's the situation. A man, a Jew, enters into service into another Jew. Let's say the man is not married. He has no wife. Can his master, no, let's say he is married. Can his master give him another wife in addition to his own, even if his wife doesn't come in with him? In other words, Irwin says, I'm coming in alone. Okay, Irwin, you're working for me. Do I have the right as Irwin's master to say, I'm giving you, by the way, a woman, a non-Jewish servant of mine, and you can have her with you, 6 years is a long time. You and she can share relationships. But when you go out, since I gave you this woman, the woman doesn't go out with you. I gave her to you. She and her children belong to me. Okay? Okay. Now that's what the text says. I want you to hear it. If Irwin comes into work for me, first of all, if he has a wife, I'm not allowed to give him another woman. If he's married, I can't give him another woman. Let's say I want to produce a lot of little servants. So I decide I'm going to start raising servants. I'm going to marry Irwin off to a woman who is a non-Jewish servant, and they're going to produce servants. Can't do it. Can't do it. In many ancient societies, I just want you to know, slaves were not only procured, they were bought, they were raised. Do you all understand this? When you acquired a slave as a master, you had the right to give that slave a wife, And not only did you have the right to the slave, but you had the right to the wife who you gave him and any children that were produced. Okay. So in Roman times, if a person became a slave, his master had the right to give him a wife, to give him a companion, whatever you want to call it, and any children that were produced belonged to the master as well as the woman. That was the master's property. Hebrew slaves, you couldn't do that with. If a man was married, you could not provide him with a woman for the sake of breeding slaves. It was not allowed. You couldn't do it. Let's say the man was not married. Let's say Erwin was a bachelor. And he says, I want to work for you, but look, 6 years is a long time. And I don't have a wife. Could you provide me with a little female companionship over the course of the years? I don't know how you call it. And let's say I have a female servant, and I say to Erwin, all right, you're entitled to to be with this female servant, but since she was my servant, you when you go out at the end of your period of servitude, you can't take her with you. She's not yours. And if you produce any children from her, you can't take the children out. She's not yours. Okay. Now, Erwin can say, you know what? Keep your woman. Forget the children. I'm just going to serve you, and I'll spend the next 6 years being a bachelor. Okay. I'm going to be a bachelor for 6 years. It's Erwin's choice, and I cannot force him. I cannot force Erwin to take on a comfort woman or a woman to be with him, and I can't force him to procreate and produce children, other servants for me. I cannot do it. Not allowed. Okay. If Erwin decides he wants to do that, I can provide him with a woman, but Erwin does, when he goes out, he does not take the woman with him. That's what this verse says. If his master gives him a woman, and by the way, the woman cannot be a Jewish woman because the master hasn't the right to do that. We're not dealing here with a Jewish woman. If the master gives him a woman, not Jewish, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and the children belong to her master, and he shall go out by himself. In other words, Erwin says to me, all right, and I'm going to I see your hand, Neil. Erwin says to me, I want to work for you. I say, fine, you can work for me. And I say, Erwin, you're going to work for me for 6 years. And Erwin says, fine, I'll work for you for 6 years. And in return for that, you're going to take care of me. And when I leave, you're going to provide me with the starting income again so I can start myself. Fine, Erwin, I agree. But if Erwin says to me, and in addition to that, I want you to provide me with a woman, a wife, and when I leave, I want to take my wife and my children with me, I have to say to Erwin, sorry, not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Now, under those circumstances, what happens? Let me read one more verse and then I'll get Neil's comment. If the bondsman shall say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I shall not go free. Let's say Erwin works for me for 6 years. And at the end of 6 years, Erwin says, you know what, Rabbi, you treated me well. Or let's say he says, I've become attached to the woman that you gave me and I don't want to leave her behind to the children. I want to stay with you. I don't want to go free. This is what the verse says. His master shall then bring him to the court. They shall bring him to the door or to the doorpost. His master shall bore a hole through his ear with an awl, and that servant shall serve him forever. Okay, so here's what the scenario is. Erwin works for me. 6 years, he's got to go out. But Erwin says, I don't want to go out. I like being a servant. I like having you take care of me. Am I allowed to keep Erwin as a servant on afterward? I can, but I can't do it myself unilaterally. I've got to take him out in front to the court, he will publicly say, I love my master. Rabbi House is a good guy. I want to serve him forever. And then in the presence of the court, after they hear this, they take his ear and they take an awl. You guys know what an awl is? And they make a hole in his ear. Why did they make a hole in his ear? It's a punishment. He wants to stay a slave. The ear that heard God say, you are my servants, he has now gone and asked for another human being to be a servant. Erwin should not be a servant. At the end of 6 years, he should go forth and he should be an independent, free human being again. But if he decides, for whatever reason, either because he likes his life with me, or he's become accustomed to living in this way and he doesn't want to face the responsibilities of caring for himself, and he doesn't want to start life all over again, or if he gets attached to the woman I've given him and the children, and he says, I love you, and I love my children, and I love my wife, I want to serve you forever, he may do so, but as punishment, it's a sign of shame that he should choose to be a servant. He is brought to the elders, he is brought to the court, his ear is pierced to indicate that he has given up his freedom to be subject as a servant. Okay, Neil first, and then Lori. Go ahead, Neil.
I want to make sure I heard this correctly. Is there a hypocrisy then, because all of these guiding principles and laws only apply with dealing with Hebrews and Jews? If you have a non-Hebrew and Jew, they can be your slave.
No, they're subject to a different series of laws, Neil, but we're not covering those laws right now.
Okay.
I would have to take you to the portion of the Torah. There's a different set of rules that apply to non-Hebrew slaves than Hebrew slaves, but even though they are not Hebrews, they are still human beings created in the image of God. So though the laws are different, it is not hypocrisy. There are one set of laws that govern fellow Hebrews, and there are another set of laws with some differences, but many of the same protections that apply to everyone. So that's the short answer to your question.
And then the second question was, as you were talking about the scenario, if the woman is been enslaved for 3 years, and now she's been given to someone else for 6 years, what happens on year 6 for her?
The woman is not a Hebrew slave. The terms of 6 years only applies to Hebrew slaves. A Hebrew woman cannot be given as a wife to a Hebrew man, okay? If Erwin is my servant and he meets another Hebrew servant that he loves, another Jewish girl, and he's not married, theoretically, he and she could contract a marriage together, but that's not the usual format. Usually, you cannot give a Hebrew servant a Hebrew wife. That must wait until the Hebrew man is freed from his servitude. Then he can go and acquire a wife himself. Okay, so you would never get overlapping periods. In other words, the man is in his 4th year, the woman, so there's an overlap. You can't have that. Hebrew women also can only serve for 6 years. By the way, I have not described why would a woman become a Hebrew servant. The most common answer someone already suggested. A family is so poor. Let's say Erwin's family is so poor that he has a daughter. And he says, I don't want to be your servant. I'm working, but I can't support my whole family. I want to give you my daughter as a Hebrew servant. Is Erwin allowed to do that? Yes, but for only one purpose. He can only do that for the sake of the daughter being married. He can sell her not into servitude. He can arrange for her to be married to the person he is acquiring. A father has a right to marry his daughter off. If a father was so poor, and you know there are societies where families will do anything, their children are their property. A Hebrew man cannot sell his daughter into servitude. He can only arrange for her to become the bride or to be wedded to another man. That is the only purpose for which she can be sold. And here's the way in which it's done. Well, let me get to Lori's question first. I'm sorry, Lori, go ahead.
I was just going to comment that it seems rather sad or barbaric to punish someone for not wanting to leave. And it's just like the homeless. maybe they're incapable, maybe they're mentally unstable, maybe they're just not able to think for themselves or do for themselves. So they want to stay on because that can assure them a better life, but yet
Correct.
they're being punished because their time is up and they have to go, and they're not really capable of taking care of themselves.
It seems unfair, and yet that is the price they pay. By the way, all they're getting is a free ear piercing, Lori. All they're getting is an ear. They're not damaged. Here's the point. Yes, but they are being punished. They are being punished for choosing to remain dependent. If you are a free human being created in God's image, and you are a Jew, and you are given the chance to be free and independent again, it is a stigma. It is a shame for you to choose to be a servant. It's not so much punished as you bear the sign of your resigning your freedom. You will go around forever as the person with the bored ear, with the pierced ear, to indicate that you could have been free, the ear that heard God speak the words of freedom to the Jewish people in Egypt chose to be a slave. You're right.
But if you're incapable, then it probably wouldn't matter to you if you were shamed. But, I'd rather be in the care of someone if I can't care for myself on the street.
Okay, what does it mean? Here's the thing, Lori, and here's the last part of it. At the end of 6 years, you're with me, right? I've cared for you for 6 years. Let's say I'll go back to Erwin. I've cared for Erwin for 6 years. Now, at the end of his service, I've seen him through his difficult time. When I release him, I can't just release him with nothing. I've got to provide for him to start over. The law, which we don't have here, it mentions it later. Not only must I care for Erwin during the time of his indentured servitude to me, but I must give him the wherewithal to be able to start again. You say a person is unable to start again, and there are probably people who are, but why? If the person is a cripple or something, that may be a legitimate, but let's say the person just doesn't want to. The example given is the man who says, I like it here. It's not that I couldn't go out and do something. I could, but I don't want to. You see, in that case, it's not his incapability of going off on his own that's the problem. It's his unwillingness to be free that's the problem, Lori. It's his unwillingness to assume the responsibility of freedom. Okay, this is frustrating because I've only gotten to what, 6 verses. You can see how frustrating all this is. I'm going to stop here and just say the following. These laws of servitude are unlike any other laws that you might have thought of when we were talking about Hebrew slaves. They're so different, in fact, that someone says that a Hebrew adon, master, who acquires a servant is actually acquired a burden because his responsibilities are greater than the benefits that he gets. Why would a person subject himself to bringing someone into his house and feeding him and caring for him, and maybe his family as well, and letting him go at a certain point when he's finished his term and giving him the wherewithal to start again? You don't do that because it's profitable for you. You do it because that's what the Torah says you're supposed to do. You take care of the person when he needs it because he's poor or he's in debt because he's a criminal. You provide him with what he needs for the period of his service. And then when the time comes, you let him go and you give him the wherewithal to start his life over again. This isn't punishment. This is protection, okay? And therefore, when the Torah doesn't eliminate servitude, it doesn't eliminate it because servitude in this case provides a service that society needs. In an era before social welfare programs, in an era before government help, in an era when people oftentimes, as they do in the world today, if they don't have the wherewithal, they starve and they die. And I have to tell you, there are many places in the world where if you do not have food, if you do not have land, if you do not have property, and there is no one you can turn to who is going to be sympathetic, you know what the answer is? You're going to die. Okay? In our modern world, especially in underdeveloped or non-developed societies, the hard rule is those who have, and unless they share with those who do not will die. The Bible long ago said it's not fair for human beings who have to disregard the needs of human beings who have not. We must create an equitable society in which people take care of other people, whether it's through leaving their fields ungleaned, through providing tithes. We already know about tithes, they go to the poor. There were a number of institutions, including Tzedakah, that were providing. Now, to go to Neil's question again. Okay, to go back to Neil's question. What do we have today? Neil said, does this exist in Orthodox society? Yes, it does. I'll give you just a couple of examples. Not anymore the servitude. This indenture business doesn't exist anymore. Most Jews don't have farms. They don't take in indentured servants. But here's the way it works. In every Jewish community, there is something called the Gemilut Chesed Society. We would call it a free loan society. Every Jewish community provides funds for Jews who are in need. It lends them funds at no interest, provides them for their needs so they can sustain themselves in a time of emergency. That is something the Jewish community does. In Orthodox societies, there are all kinds of societies that provide all kinds of things. Any of you ever see shtisel? They're called gemachs. Let's say a young girl wants to get married, but she doesn't have money for a wedding dress. In Orthodox societies, once you have a wedding dress, you donate the wedding dress to a gemach, to a charitable society. And when other poor girls come along who can't afford a wedding dress, the society makes the dress available to them at no money or for a pittance. Why? So that no bride should have to not go without a wedding dress. Let's say you have other kinds of gemachs for other kinds of reasons. Any kind of commodity the Orthodox community provides for those who need because of the charity of the Orthodox in the community who give what they have in order to provide that for people who need it. Go ahead, Lori.
Many years ago, I donated my wedding dress to Beit Yeshiva, and they were so happy. And I couldn't understand like why they would even be that ecstatic, but they were so appreciative. And now I understand why.
Yeah, and not only dresses. If I have an electric fan and I no longer need it anymore, I can turn around and give it to Goodwill, but I can give it to a gemach. The word gemach means gimilut chasadim, deeds of kindness. And the gemach will take it. And if someone comes along and needs a space heater or a fan or something, the gemach will give it to them for as long as they need it until they're able to do, maybe they acquire, then they'll give it back to the gemach and maybe they'll be supporters. In other words, in your moment of need, you turn to the community who helps you. And when you're in a position you don't need that help anymore, you can return it to the gemach and it can go to help another person. Neil, does that explain some of what the Jewish community does today? We do not let our poor, our impoverished, our needy suffer alone, whether it's medical help, whether it's whatever it is. There are all kinds of institutions in the Jewish community, more formal, less formal. Sometimes they're controlled by a group called the Federation, the Jewish Federation Council. These are big organizations that collect money and distribute it. Sometimes they're in local communities. People in local communities help other people. There are societies for children whose parents can't send them to a Jewish day school to learn, and they provide free tuitions for these children from other people who support them so they can go to school and learn. And many, many other kinds of societies as well. Okay. This is the idea of mutual responsibility. Not what is our right, but what is our responsibility to other people in society. All right. This is frustrating because I've covered 6 verses with you of 100 verses. Okay. If I were to go into other things with you, you would be surprised at how light years ahead of their time the Torah was. Okay. Okay. The next section that I didn't deal with after the laws of a Hebrew servant concerned the laws of murder. Well, what constitutes murder? The Torah is very interesting. It says, I'm just going to read this to you and then I'm stopping, I promise. Okay. One who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. What does that tell us? You can pay for damages to people, but one who takes intentionally a human life, there is no redemption that you can pay. In some societies, by the way, you could buy your way out. You could pay the family for the life of a poor person. Let's say I kill someone and the family needs money. In some societies, I can say, what's your child's worth? What's he worth? I'll pay you for. In Jewish law, a human life is so sacred, you cannot redeem a human life with payment, okay? You cannot pay for a human life. One who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death, okay? But for one who has not lain in ambush and God has caused it to come to his hand, I will provide for you a place to which you may flee. Let's say I don't kill someone intentionally. Let's say I'm guilty of negligent homicide, which means I was reckless. Should I have to pay for it with my life? No, says the Torah. There's a difference between intentional murder and negligent homicide. Whereas the price for murder, the only price that can be paid is the life of the murderer. In a case of intentional homicide, there's a different penalty. It's more appropriate. You get into these things and you read the text that you have and you say, my God, this was genius. In an age before the people were told, intentional murder, you can't set a value on life. You can't buy your way out to killing. If you intentionally kill, if a man acts intentionally against his fellow to murder him with guile, you must take him from my altar. You shall take him to die. You cannot redeem that. There is no redemption. You can't buy your way out. Life for life, okay? That is how sacred life is. But short of that, other kinds of injuries, non-intentional murders, there the law is going to deal in different categories. This is the balance of this book. Now, if I went through just the rest of the book of Exodus, we'd be here for weeks. I'm finishing it tonight, unless you want to continue on. So this is the law. Now you understand why 10 commandments aren't enough. You can't live a life, you can't govern a society with 10 general rules or principles. You need specific case law, and Torah law is case law. It says in this situation, this is what you do. It doesn't give you legal, it gives you concrete cases. If your ox damages the ox of another, if you damage the property of another, if someone entrusts you to watch his property and you are negligent, then this and this is what you will do. If someone breaks into your house in the middle of the night and in defending your house and your family and your property, you kill him. This is not a case of premeditated murder. You do not pay for that in the way you would in a case of premeditated murder, nor is it a case of accidental homicide. In this case, the person who entered your house under these conditions made himself liable. You can see how you've got to deal with specifics. You have got to deal with the concrete, and that is the genius of Jewish law. That is the genius of Jewish law. It is a law that governs the society. All right, with that, I'm going to stop, but now I'm 15. Anybody have any questions, any comments? Okay. Any final discussions? All right. You want?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, you're welcome, Lori. Just go ahead and look at the following verses. You don't have to, if anything doesn't make sense, but the commentaries in this book, though sometimes hard to understand, you can go through them and they do make sense. They do explain a lot of things to you. And whether it's a criminal law, or whether it's a civil law, or whether it's a ritual law, these laws all have reasons to them. It's not just the fact that that's the law. You begin to see that there's a genius to the law. It's designed to do something, to teach us something, to humanize us and to humanize the society in which we live. Yes, Leslie, go ahead.
The one thing that does bother me is, though, if you strike your parent or you speak that it's death, and that's pretty
Okay.
extreme.
Okay. Leslie has come up. I stopped deliberately there, but I will explain to you that law. One further down, one who strikes his father and his mother shall surely be put to death. Okay, what don't you like about that, Leslie? Obviously, you've never raised a teenager.
She's muted.
Oh, you're muted again, Leslie. Unmute yourself. What don't you like?
Punishment maybe, but death seems to be awfully extreme.
All right, so now can I explain the law to you in the way it's meant to be explained? Who do children belong to?
Parents.
Children belong to. In ancient times, they were the property of the parents. If a child did anything to anger his parents, what did the parents have the right to do? Anything they damn well pleased. This law says if a child strikes a parent, the parent is not allowed to put him to death. He must bring him to the court, and the court must say, it's a protection, Leslie. In an age in which parents had the absolute right to do whatever they wanted to their children, this law comes and says that if a child strikes a parent, he becomes worthy of death. He can be put to death, but the parent can't unilaterally decide that, can't do that. He must be brought before the court. Okay?
Oh, okay. I didn't read it that way.
Well, I know, and that's why we have to read it with the commentary. Okay? He becomes liable. What it should say, Leslie, is this way. I'll read it for you. One who strikes his father or his mother has become liable to be put to death, is liable to death. What that means is if he is found guilty by the court, he can be put to death. Now, here's the thing, Leslie. Let's say your child angers you, and in a fit of anger, you throw a bowl at him or a knife at him and kill him. There's no punishment for that. But if you have to take that child and bring him out to the court and admit to all your neighbors that this child of yours is incorrigible and you want the court to kill him, we're protecting your child from you.
Mhm.
You cannot take it. SVU, Special Victims Unit, is not going to visit and send you to jail, right? Because you haven't the right to do that. Even though your child for doing something, it's really a serious crime. We can talk about that another time. But even though your child did this heinous act of striking you and injuring you becomes liable to death, you can't do it yourself. You must deliberate, which means you must bring him to court. You cannot act. And if you do act impetuously, Leslie, if in the midst of your anger you kill him, guess what happens? You go out to the court yourself for murder. Okay? So it is not to justify killing children. It is to prevent parents from exercising a right they had in biblical times. In other societies, a child like a parent, a child like a slave was his parents' property, and his parents could do with him. Bill Cosby once said, I brought you into this world and I can take you out of it, okay? About his children. You can't do that. In Jewish life, you cannot. A parent has no right to take the life of a child. I may have brought this child into the world through being his parent, but I cannot take the child out of the world. I must go through this process. Go ahead.
What you were the Bible that you're reading and this book that I have, because the book that I have actually just said, he who strikes his mother or father shall be put to death. That's what it says in
Yes.
in this
Okay.
in this. I have this book.
Okay, and that's fine. But in the Hebrew, it says, okay.
But it says something else. Yeah.
Yeah, it says here, umake avi ve'imo mot yumat. If a person strikes his father or his mother, he shall surely die. Now, that doesn't mean that his father and his mother may kill him. It says, it really means mot yumat. If a person strikes his father or his mother, mot yumat, he becomes subject to the death penalty. Okay. But the father or the mother is not allowed to execute him.
Okay, because it didn't say that.
Yes, yes. And that's the understanding. Suddenly now, it is not a right for the parent to kill his child. It's a protection for the child against the unilateral action of an angry parent. And that's the way the Torah reads it. Okay. So once again, you have to be careful how you read the text. That's why when later on it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You probably assume that if you put out my eye, I get to put out your eye. Or if you cut off my hand, I get to cut off your hand. That's what it says, right? It's not what it means. All right, so be very, very careful. That's why we have rabbis, okay? Go to your rabbi and see what he tells you to do. Okay. All right. Next week, we are changing direction. We are not going to any more laws. I hope I've showed you how complex these laws are. We're going to turn to back to our chapter. We're going to find out what happened when Moses went up to the mountain to receive the 10 commandments and what the heck caused the Jewish people to build the golden calf. So next week, I'll send you the information. I'll send you the notes on tonight. I will send you all the information. Okay. And Leslie, I know you're there. Laura, you're part of the class. I think everybody else, Neil, you're part of the class. Okay, so everybody who's on, I will send you notes. From this point on, I don't send notes to everybody. Up until now, I've been sending notes to anybody who wanted to join. But if you're part of the class, you are now joined, you are now in, I will send you notes. I'll send you follow-up assignments and that's it, okay? Having said that, yes, go ahead, Neil.
You're not going to get to slip in that little follow-up assignment stuff without us pushing back. You went from sending notes to sending follow-up assignments. I heard that. I don't want that.
You don't want follow-up assignment. Here's the rules, Neil. There is no punishment. There is no consequence for not doing my follow-up assignment. As a matter of fact, theoretically, you don't have to read. By the way, if you want to read Sachs is brilliant on this point. So those of you, if you I need it, I'll send it out again to you. But Sachs, when he talks about this, I